Can you hear that? Okay, yeah. Thank you all for coming. My name's Kaleem Aftab. I'm the author of a biography on Spike Lee, and I have the great pleasure of hosting this discussion on 12 Years a Slave and the issues that it raises and has been talked about. We have a great panel with us today. On the end of the panel, he insists I call him Martin, but I'm going to try once, is Ole Martin Ihle.
That's not bad, that's not bad.
Who, from henceforth, will be called Martin by me, who has a PhD in African American studies, specialising in the figure of the pimp. Next to me, on the left, of my left, right for you, is Chicago-born playwright Bonnie Greer, who's been living in London, where she's a well-known commentator for the last couple of decades. To my right is Ekow Eshun, who I've known for several years. He was a programmer, he was the artistic director of the Institute of Contemporary Arts. He's a well-known writer and author and and a commentator on culture. And at the end is a Tromsø programmer plus a film critic from who's based in Sunderland, England, Neil Young. The first sort of issue, I don't know how many of you have seen 12 Years a Slave. I have no idea what the panelists think of the film. I just want a little heads up from each of you what your thoughts on the film are and why you think possibly it's been so polarizing. If I start on the far left with Martin.
What I personally think of the movie, I like the film. First of all, I'm not a film expert, so I know more about African American culture than I do about movies. But as far as the movie is concerned, I liked it. It didn't make quite the impression on me that I hoped it would do, but maybe some of you can explain that to me later. But when you say it's polarizing, I checked it. Polarized by some critics, I think we should emphasize, because I checked this movie is getting rave reviews mostly all over. Like of 253 reviews, it had 97% giving it 9 of 10 on Rotten Tomatoes. So it's a film that's getting rave reviews, but it's a touchy subject. Slavery is a national trauma in America. And it's a very politicized subject. So I think that everybody wants this movie to be right, to be just right, because it's maybe the first serious attempt to make an accurate movie or take on slavery. And then you got a discussion about authenticity more than you have about a great movie. And then people will find mistakes.
Bonnie, how do you follow that up?
Well, I mean, it's the history. It's about my family. It's a history of my people directly. I think it's true. There's an expression in Chicago, this bus only comes around once in a while. So, you want very much to support something like this, back for the team, and hopefully make sure that maybe someone else can make a movie, but I've lived long enough to see quite a few movies made about slavery or around slavery. So in a way, I've seen this sort of thing before. When I was very young, Roots was the movie and actually had much more of an effect on people than 12 Years a Slave, simply because there was less media. It was very profound. And of course, when I was a child, when I first saw on television Gone with the Wind, which for my generation was, like making a movie about, Dachau, basically, with people sort of dancing around it. Detested Gone with the Wind. And now, as I've gotten older, I understand that Gone with the Wind is not about slavery. It's about Red Butler and Scarlet. So it's all right to look at it for me now. But 12 Years a Slave is a very difficult movie in a sense. It's the first time that a black director's ever had this sort of take and a chance to actually tell a story. And so one wants to be supportive of that. But this is a film festival, and we all love film, and we're all here because of film. So it would be wrong for me not to discuss it as a piece of cinema, because at the end of the day, that's what's important. And for me, it's not a great piece of cinema. It's a great event. It's a great moment and sort of talking point, and it's the younger generation's slavery movie. So for that, it's important. But if we lay it out in the history of the cinema around this subject, I think there have been better.
Ekow.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think 12 Years Later, I think, is a fascinating film. I think it's a beautiful film. And I think it's a fantastically restrained film, is the main thing. I think, you know, we look through this lineage of some of the movies that have addressed similar topics, Gone with the Wind, Amistad, and so on. And what we see very often is this desire to tell a story with a full cinematic armory of strings and kind of shots up at people and kind of heroic silhouette against the sun. This does very little of that, and it's up with piece with Steve McQueen's other films, which again are very sparing in their dialogue and are interested in beauty as much as horror. And the interesting thing about this, to take a point that Martin was making earlier, it's not the most shocking film, it's not the most striking film, it's not the most violent film, it's not any of these things, but what it, in a way, it's defined almost by the things it chooses not to do. It's defined by its restraint as much as its unsparingness at the same time. So what I find fascinating about it, what I think is important, is that in effect, because of Steve's background, this has some of the sensibility of an art movie smuggled into the mainstream, and then a kind of pitiless desire to only tell one point of view, to only tell one kind of story, rather than do a thing of trying to create a movie that works for everyone in different ways.
And Neil?
I kind of came to this film later than most critics. I paid to see it in my local cinema when it was released, which was last week, and by which point it had been out since Toronto in September last year. And in Toronto, people stumbled out of the screening, on their knees, praising it to the heavens. And I'm a professional critic, and part of the job of being a critic is you watch films with your own perspective and all that, but it's impossible to watch this film. It's like the beginning of the film you see going through sugar cane. It's impossible to see the film because there's so much noise around it. So I felt as I was navigating all this while trying to get to grips with the film as a narrative, and I had a lot of problems. In the end of the film, I was kind of underwhelmed. I was disappointed. It was kind of what I'd expected, because Steve McQueen's first film, Hunger, written by Enda Walsh, an Irish playwright, to me was an exciting new voice in cinema, strong new voice coming from the art world, doing something a bit confrontational, tackling the subject of the hunger strike, Bobby Sands, which is still a hugely incendiary subject in many parts of my country, and can still get you beaten up if you say the wrong thing in the wrong pub. He then goes on to make Shame, written by Abby Morgan, about sex addiction, and to me this was kind of a step down in terms of his ambition, in terms of what he was trying to do. And in this one, it's as if he's stepping even further away from being a genuinely confrontational voice. This film won the Audience Prize in Toronto as well as getting all the critics' prizes. And to me, it's amazing how uncontroversial this film is. You read the reviews by most critics, and it's as if the same person's writing them. And even the people who are against the film, and I'm kind of in the middle towards negative, are coming at it from the same angle. And to me, the film is a failure because it isn't sufficiently it's not inspiring enough fire. What it's inspiring is a respectful reverence that it's an important subject which is tackled in a serious, sad way, and it's being criticised from various angles. But to me, the film it needs to leave you burning, and instead, to me, it leaves you. I don't know. I think most people emerge from the cinema feeling kind of chastened, and they feel that they've experienced something. But I just don't think it's the kind of, I think it's, to me, a missed opportunity.
See, I disagree with that to the extent that I wouldn't say it should be anything in as much as I don't think the film itself sets up to say, I'm going to be the most confrontational, the most this, the most that. One of the really interesting things that happens with race, and I'm sort of moving on from it, by the way, one of the really interesting things that happens with race, I think, so much of the time, is that such a freighted topic that we bring a level of expectation to it that somehow, in one moment, we have to encapsulate every single thing, every single moment of animus, of tension, of fear, of loathing, all of these things in one go. No, I don't think any single piece of work can do that. And I think the smart thing about this film is that it actually hasn't attempted to do that. It hasn't attempted to be a definitive work about slavery. It just so happens that there are very few other films on the subject. What it's tried to do is be as acute as possible with one story. That's it, I think.
I'm glad that we've got to this point, because 80% of the reviews do not talk about the film as a piece of film. They talk about the subject. Now, you cannot, in this day and age, be against this film if you talk about the subject. Now, why? First of all, Steve McQueen doesn't deserve, he's an important filmmaker, he doesn't deserve the film to be talked about only about the subject. This is a piece of cinema, and it's not a piece of cinema, it's a movie where you go buy popcorn and you go in there, you sit in the dark, and you look at a movie. 90% of the people who are going to go see 12 Years a Slave are going to go see a movie. Now, it doesn't work as a movie, and it's as simple as that. My husband, who is English, and about as English as you can be, turned and looked at me at one point and said, he said, "But why is it so bland?" And I sat there because I couldn't find the word. I mean, again, this is my history. It didn't touch me. And so my critical hat came on so I could understand what was happening on the screen, that it didn't affect me. Why wasn't it? One of the problems, and I want to say this as a critical friend, because I think that Steve McQueen is an important director. This is an important subject. There's some good work in this movie. But if we who are lovers of film want to put this movie down and put it on the dissecting table, there are a lot of problems with it as a movie, and that's why I don't think we're going to remember this movie as long as people think we're going to. And that's a shame, because the subject is very important. But partly, just looking at it technically, the big problem is the movie hasn't been dramatized. There are a lot of incidents in it, a lot of things happen, but there's no story in it. There's nothing that's going on like that. The other thing I want to say too, and I really felt angry about, and I didn't realize for a couple of days later, as I say, my people were enslaved. I don't think they were all dressed in brown, beige, and green throughout the movie. I wanted to see some life. I wanted to see some color. I didn't quite understand why they all looked the same. And it's little things like that which made me see the piece as being more of an art piece than actually the story it should be.
Before we move on, I would like to just recap a little, because I think this brings up many of the issues, more issues that are perhaps being discussed that we could read on the internet, where I think that the actual reviews being done by newspapers have not been so great, along the lines of a lot of people who are reviewing it based on slavery. It's not getting much criticism, but I'm on the other side. I think the film's fantastic, so I will going to come out there and defend it, because I feel like that voice needs to come out on this panel. And so I also feel like we've had questions of authenticity raised, questions of history, where it fits as a historical portrait, the importance of it as a historical piece has been raised. The blandness of the film, it's interesting, because I agree with Bonnie, but for all those reasons I see it as a positive rather than a negative. And so I think Ekow was sliding on that way as well. So I think this is really interesting, but I think it's also worth mentioning before we go on that this is based on a memoir on a book that was written in 1855. And that book had its authenticity questioned a lot at the time.
Exactly.
Many people questioned whether Solomon was telling the truth. There's a lot of research been done that said that all these law cases definitely happened. But some people believe the editor wrote much of the story himself based on what Solomon told. There's not much doubting that Solomon was a slave at all, and that he experienced these 12 years. But what this then raises for me is what's the historical context from that Steve McQueen's looking at in terms of slavery as a piece of cinema, adapting a book that's been questioned, and what is the true facts? I think this is worth raising. I think I'm going to bring Martin in here to talk a bit about authenticity.
Yes, when it comes to first-person slave narratives, a lot of them has been questioned about historical accuracy because, as you mentioned, a lot of them were written by white editors. And in the 12 Years a Slave's case, it was written by a white lawyer, David Wilson, who happened also to be very active in the abolitionist movement. So he has been suspected by some historians to juice up the story as to rally, the public opinion against slavery, which might be the case. But and also, Steve McQueen is taking fictional liberties in the movie, which is that are not in the book. Like when, for instance, at the beginning, when the kidnappers takes out a female slave to rape her, and Omar Little, I think it is, from from The Wire, is trying to stop him, and he kills the male slave. That doesn't happen in the book, and you might say that that is also quite unlikely because slaves were very valuable cargo, and especially after 1820, when the Atlantic slave trade was abolished. So then you had to keep the stock you had. It became much more valuable. But then again, I just read up on a lot of the criticism, and I think it's wrong to judge a movie on historical accuracy alone, that I think a lot of critics do. Because, as you mentioned, it's also a drama, and it should be judged if it works as a drama. And I remember just briefly about seeing Frost Nixon, and I saw the background commentary, and the people doing the inventories there, like the designers, they said that if you want the movie to look authentic, 70s authentic, you can't make it authentic, like historically accurate. You have to filter it through contemporary lenses, because the 70s won't look like the 70s to us. And in that sense, I think the movie does a fairly good job, but you can always discuss if it was dramaturgically successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, agree with a number of things that you said. I agree with lots of what Bonnie said, and also what you're saying. I think that, the point about movies is they're not real. However, this is based on a true story. And I think it's trying to do two things at once, and I would say primarily successfully. So I think it's trying to stay fairly faithful to the story, but it's also, I think, trying to tell an emotional truth, an emotional authenticity, an emotional verite. And for me, that's more important than historical detail. What's important to me is the feeling that you get left with when you come out of the film. So I think what's interesting, to come to your point, Neil, is that I don't think the feeling you come out, well, certainly I didn't come out from that film, is a feeling of deep outrage, blah, 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 cataclysm. But what I think you do feel, I would suggest, is a level of sadness and a level of empathy with the overarching subject matter. And I think that's crucially important, because I think it's so easy to talk about slavery or to talk about race or racism in the abstract. And the point about the unflinchingness of this, the point about telling a singular story rather than trying to tell a broad screen story of slavery as a whole, is that it brings you closer to those individuals. And that, for me, is really important. That, for me, is what's at the heart of this thing.
What's fascinating, too, and I agree with Ekow very much, what's fascinating, and I haven't said this before, and maybe this is not a naughty thing to say, but I wonder what an American director would have done with this, as it feels like a very British film, in the sense that there is that restraint that, as an African American, I was not. It isn't a realistic situation. And I wanted desperately to see some sort of fire in this movie, and it isn't there. And I was prepared for it because the reviews made me think that there was going to be something incredibly horrific. I almost didn't want to go see it, but I went to see it, and I sat there waiting for this horror to happen that I studied about and known about all my life, and it didn't occur. Now, maybe I'm judging it because of what I didn't see, and I think it is important for each generation to have their own dialogue with this subject. It is extremely important, and that's what's happening now. And I absolutely agree. I mean, I knew David Frost, and he went to see Frost Nixon. He said, of course it didn't happen like that, but you know, I had a good time anyway, because it was about it. But this movie, the discussion that's being had around it isn't about the movie, it's about the subject. That's my argument.
Yeah, I'm talking about the movie then, Bonnie. You said earlier you didn't think it worked as a dramatic story.
No, not at all.
Whereas I feel that it was quite a great screen adaptation of the book. Do you think the book doesn't work as a dramatic story, or do you think it's a problem with Steve McQueen's adaptation?
I think that, you know, first of all, and again, I'm a movie person. I want to go and get lost in the movies. I mean, I don't care what the movie is about. I go there to I want to go for a voyage with something. You have a face on the screen for 2 hours. I want to get in there with that face, and I want to make the journey. I don't care what the rest of it is happening around it. I know a lot of this history. I didn't go for the history. I wanted to go to get lost in this story. It didn't happen for me because I didn't know, and being a dramatist, I'm going to say this as an ABC, I didn't know who Solomon was in himself. I knew what happened to him. I knew how he reacted to what happened to him, but I didn't know who he was. I saw him with the fiddle. I saw him being, you know, really a big man on the street and being loved and then being captured and taken away. I didn't know who he was, and I really wanted to see what changed this man. What did he do? The most powerful moment is when McQueen has Chiwetel sing that gospel song with the rest of the enslaved people. That was the most dramatic moment in the film, besides the fact that Michael Fassbender steals a picture. But I stood there, and that really touched me, and I wanted to see more of those kind of things, but I didn't know who the guy was, just ABC, and that's what I mean by dramatizing.
Is that, do you think, because it's, at that point, the film feels about solidarity? Because the first image of the film is a group of people with Solomon Northup in the middle. That's the first thing that you see. So it's clearly putting him in the context of a wider group of people. But to me, it's interesting that he's right in the middle. You know, it's not like Life of Brian, where you know the main character might be off the back somewhere, or the way that Pasolini shoots Christ. You have a crowd of people, and there's somebody
and
here.
He's a good example.
Yeah. So you have front and centre. You have Solomon Northup, played by Chiwetel Ejiofor, in a context. And to me, that was interesting because what I think the film doesn't do sufficiently is to give you the context. And I think a good film, a classic film, can tell an individual story and make it universal and give you the social context. But it's very hard to do it. I don't think this film does it.
But if you have a camera on somebody's face for 2.5 hours and close up, technically, something's got to be going on with that face.
Of course, the paradox is that the way that Solomon Northup gets through it, you have the character whose children are taken away, Eliza, and she is whimpering and whining, and she's this outgoing figure, and also, so on the one hand he's contrasted with her, on the other hand he has to keep his knowledge, the fact that he's literate, he's intelligent and educated, except for the scene, the kind of, I think, ludicrous scene where they're engineering the canal, and all of a sudden he jumps into action like some kind of, you know, brainiac, and for somebody that's meant to be keeping his knowledge quiet, he's very kind of voluble with it. So to me, yeah, you've got the paradox of making a film about this internalized character, And I think Ejiofor's performance is terrific. I mean, I think he deserves, you know, all the praise that he's getting. It's one of the things about the film that I do like. But to talk about the way that Steve McQueen's adapted it, I think we have to talk about the way John Ridley's adapted it, because he wrote the screenplay.
Exactly.
I think we have to talk about the way that Hans Zimmer's music is used, or I would say misused. Because I don't think it's a coincidence that the one scene that everybody finds powerful, in which Solomon Northup is kind of strung up under a tree and people are going about their daily lives behind him, turning a blind eye, is one of the very few scenes in the film where there is no music, and you're not being told what to think. And by the end of it, I felt as though I'd been set free, because I didn't have to listen to this horrible Hollywood score underlining
And
everything.
the beginning was horrible.
You know, and to me, it's talking down to the audience. It's 2014 now. Do we have to score movies like It's Still Gone with a Flippin' Wind?
Ooh, what was that?
That was nice.
I think that was Zimmer.
I agree with you about the soundtrack, but I think some really interesting things are going to happen with this film over the next few years, in as much as I think that it will survive a number of rewatchings and scrutinies, because I think it's a kind of film that we see very little of, in as much as Steve McQueen hasn't come, unlike almost every lauded director, Steve McQueen hasn't come out of an entertainment complex background. He hasn't come out of making big movies. You know, if you watch any of his work as an artist, it's completely